This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's the place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Well, welcome, folks. Here we are gathered together today again at Core Brain Journal, and we have a very interesting, I'm really pleased to introduce to you folks today Scott Stevens. He's an individual who's written 3 interesting books. Stay tuned. By the end of this interview, we're going to tell you how Scott is going to give away to this audience each one of these 3 books in a giveaway by the end of the meeting here. So it's interesting I use the word meetings, Scott. But anyway, so what happens is meeting is a term on the recovery side that people use a great deal. That's what the sort of inside joke might be if you weren't familiar with recovery. So Scott I'm going to do a brief introduction and tell you a little bit about him. Scott is Scott Stevens. He lives in Burlington, Wisconsin. He's the author of 3 award-winning alcoholism recovery books and is the creator of Alcoholology. Almost got it right. And what happens, he's a founder. Scott is a founding influencer for healthtap.com, the world's largest medical portal, where he reports on alcohol impact on physical and mental health. He's also the PR officer for Addicted Minds and Associates. He is out there, folks, really trying to make a difference. So welcome, Scott.
And thank you, Dr. Parker.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be on the program.
Thank you. So take a moment now and tell us a little bit about who you are personally. What's going on in your personal life?
My personal life is today. It's fantastic, but it wasn't so fantastic about a decade ago when alcohol turned on me. I have 2 degrees in journalism, which just means I took math for idiots, but I did succeed in a very excellent journalism career. Worked my way up on the corporate side in marketing for a mutual fund firm, and life had the outward appearances of all going great. But I was drinking 2 liters of Jack Daniels a day, and that led me down a very dangerous slope. Physically, of course, career-wise, we like to live with this term functional alcoholic, but we face the reality that nobody's really functional when they're under the influence. And so with all the things that happened in my life, I came to that crossroads where I can continue to drink and die, or I can get help and live. And as I did that, I switched back to my first love. And Dr. Parker, I'm one of the only few people on the planet who can say that they've not only lived their dream job once, but they're living it twice, because I'm back to reporting now.
So good for you.
Reporting, and where my focus is on alcoholism is through my own experience with the disease of alcoholism. But as I started my recovery journey, and to come across all these studies, these evidence-based studies on what alcohol does to otherwise healthy tissue beyond the disease of alcoholism. And it occurred to me that I'm an educated man. I have never heard these things in my life. And if I haven't heard them, there's a lot of people who haven't heard them either. So my journalistic side on healthtap.com and through my own website, that explores the health ramifications of drinking alcohol. And my 3 books deal with, in addition to my personal journey, some research I've done in speaking with alcoholics and counselors to find out, what's going on when a person relapses, what's going on in the early stages of recovery. And that great book for women who are expecting, What to Expect When You're Expecting. I could call these books that, but it's more than that. It's an expression of my personal journey and my best wishes for anybody on that path.
It's so good to hear you talk, because I worked in addiction medicine for many years myself, and I think exactly what you're talking about is people really need to hear it, and we're going to talk some more about specific questions and some ideas, some transformational ideas that really need to take place in the entire community. Anybody that's interested in mind health on any level needs to really hear what Scott has to say. And by the way, in the show notes, we're going to have all the links to the various websites that Scott was talking about just a moment. But for a moment, let's run back to where you were, Scott. at that horrible moment when you were doing two liters of Jack Daniels, and share with our listeners what turned you around. What was the pain in your life? What was the transformational moment there where you said, I got to do something different here?
I nearly died not once but twice. Once from drinking too much alcohol. And that was pretty much the critical time of my decision making. I've already had legal troubles through drinking and driving, marital troubles. I drank my way out of one marriage and into another one, and out of that one too. So I had all of these other signs, but this is the only disease that convinces you don't have it. So of course I was managing this. I was drinking 2 liters, just a sip at a time, just to keep myself from withdrawing. But one day I was ready to hop a plane from Milwaukee to Phoenix, Arizona, and I passed out in the airport. I woke up at an ER a few miles away with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.612. And by way of reference, 0.40 is what killed singer Amy Winehouse. So I was almost flammable at that point.
Wow.
So, and as I was beginning to come to slightly under 0.50, I pulled the stuff out of my arms, walked out against medical advice, and tried to get back to the airport to catch another flight. Of course, they wouldn't let me, but my tolerance had become a danger to my very existence. It was no longer cheating the work schedule, or no longer just keeping my blood alcohol level between pass out and awake. It was a difference of, if I keep doing this, I am not going to come to next time.
Now, real quickly, there's a vocabulary moment right there, because some people are not familiar with recovery lingo. Let's talk about tolerance for just a second, because people really, yes, you might know a little bit about it, but let's talk about it a little more specifically so people understand what you say when you said that.
As a person's drinking or using any drug, the idea of continually consuming that drug will eventually build a tolerance to that drug in your body. Now, DNA, your alcohol does change the DNA in your body, and your muscles, your fibers, your tissues actually prefer burning that alcohol molecule to the sugar molecule. So then your body becomes dependent on using alcohol. Your tolerance goes up as you begin to dump more alcohol into that body. So when a person like me has the disease of alcoholism, I have no idea what it's like to drink non-alcoholically, and a non-alcoholic has no idea what it's like to drink alcoholically. When I have 2 beers, I feel nothing. It's been a long time since I've had 2 beers.
I was just going to ask.
But I'll tell you, it doesn't faze me. And there's a more casual drinker out there who has 2 beers and they're face down, or they're a giggling mess. What I have is tolerance. That amount of alcohol impacts me very little. Your body responds to tolerance in different ways. There's a chart that is in many iterations out there, but it generally shows that your peripheral vision, your nerve reaction time, that all begins to slow with the very first drink, which is about 0.02 blood alcohol concentration. The legal level for driving in the U.S. is 0.08. They're considering lowering that, but that's another issue that I don't want to touch today. But beyond that, 0.20 is between 0.2 and 0.3 is considered a pass-out zone, where your body will pass out. Because alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, it's going to sedate you. And at that level of sedation, person is more than likely to pass out. My tolerance, on the other hand, I was just warming up the car at that level.
So you were at a serious level that would put anybody else out, and you were just strutting along. Not a problem.
Not a problem. Well, plenty of problems.
Yeah, I mean, but in terms of how you looked on the
them.
outside, I think that's a really key point, because, you look good, they were promoting you, you were having additional responsibilities. They wouldn't have been flying you somewhere if they didn't think your contribution was meaningful. But by the way, you were running all day, every day, a serious level of alcohol, because even though you weren't necessarily drinking at that moment, you were carrying it with you.
And that was the other part of this equation. When I say I almost died twice, the second time was from alcohol withdrawal. And alcohol withdrawal is one of the only two drug withdrawals that can be fatal. A heroin addict may wish that they were dying when they're going through withdrawal, but
Yeah.
it's not fatal. Benzodiazepines and alcohol are the only two drug withdrawals that can be fatal. And I was taking myself off of alcohol and began to sweat profusely, and I passed out. I crashed. I went to the hospital. At one point my blood pressure was 49/17. The
Wow.
withdrawal from this drug almost took me out because I had become physically dependent on it, and I
Hmm.
wasn't getting my tolerance dose to keep me functioning.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's really, and we've heard other stories like this, but yours is exemplary in how painful and difficult it must have been. So then, did you actually do a rehab? And as you hadn't been working a program, so you weren't going to AA, you weren't doing a 12-step program at that point, right?
I was not. At that point, it was do something or die. And I did go to an inpatient treatment with Valley Hope in Glendale, Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
Um, your basic 28-day program. I
Yep.
was in there. I participated. This disease is a relapsing disease, no different than cancer, no different than diabetes. And in fact, this disease has about a 90% relapse rate for anybody who's attempted to stop drinking. Doesn't mean that relapse has to be part of recovery, but for many people it is. I relapsed after going to that treatment. Fact is, it takes some people, a lot of trips to rehab, and that's one of the things that really needs to change in addiction medicine today is to break this cycle, to say, okay, one trip through, what didn't we get? What can we learn from this? What can we apply to our next client? But in my case, it was 3 years later, and I relapsed, and I was scratching my head in frustration and feeling like such a failure. What did I do?
Mm-hmm.
Why did I choose to return to the misery? I know the legal consequences if I drink. I know the physical consequences if I go down this path again, because it's a progressive disease, but I still went back to it. So
Mm.
that was the impetus behind my second book, Every Silver Lining Has a Cloud, to dig into why 9 of 10 people who go through rehab or attempt to stop drinking go back to this drug when the consequences are so stellar.
See, relapse and recovery, you almost have to have your face in the concrete if you're have that level of tolerance and that level of, hey, I can cope. You got the denial cooking. And one of the things I see for this, and I want to ask you, you're talking about an important transition point in your life right there.
It was.
You were trying, you weren't making it. You were trying, you weren't making it. One of the things I saw about every individual, and I think this is a theme, it sounds that you have as well, that I always look at the progress that a person made even though they relapse. Instead of like beating yourself up and saying this is a terrible thing, it's like there's something going on here. There's some piece of this that remains not fully understood by you. And I always try to emphasize the progress that they've made moving along the line and what can they learn about that. Where are you with that concept?
Uh, I'm right with you. There's a brick wall, and I write about this in all my books, but especially my third one, where we bounce against the societal stigma. There's a feeling out there that alcoholism is morally bad, or this is a series of really dumb decisions that Scott made. But in reality, it's a very serious disease that I have. So cutting through that stigma, but as you begin the early stages of recovery, you got a realization that nobody's going to build a shrine to me just because I stopped drinking, and Lynchburg, Tennessee isn't going to stop making Jack Daniels just because I'm stopped pouring it. The world goes on, and there's always going to be this opinion out there about alcohol, and the more you let it get to you, you let me put it this way, Dr. Parker. Non-alcoholics and alcoholics drink for the same reason. It's to relieve stress. Well, that creates a stressful situation for us, and what our knee-jerk reaction is to be a jerk, and we're going to go back to the alcohol. And to overcome that stigma, to overcome the tendency to look at the past and say, oh, these are terrible mistakes I've had, and relive that trauma and instead focus on the future and what you're going to do with this recovery, whether it's in the 12-step thinking, doing it one day at a time, or just in general, actively planning for your life without alcohol. That is the transition that a lot of people will bump up against in the period of early sobriety.
So you said a couple things there. One is working a program, going to meetings, but you also talked about relationship recovery and really understand balanced relationships and how you actually handle yourself on a personal level. And one of the things that comes up so often, and I wind up talking about it with a lot of individuals in my practice, is how to help that person get into some kind of a meeting context. And I would welcome your thoughts about that. One of the things that I've seen happen is a lot of people really don't want to go into the big meetings and say they have a problem. They want to go somewhere else. And speakers meetings are one thing. I think closed groups are helpful as well. What are your thoughts about speakers meetings, closed groups, open meetings? What are your thoughts about that?
I think that a speaker meeting presents an excellent opportunity to go in there and hear the language that's being spoken and not have to speak it yourself. And that gives the person that margin of safety that otherwise would keep them circling the parking lot for weeks rather than going to a meeting. Go in there and listen to the stories, and you can identify, and that is the key thing, is to try to identify rather than exclude. My very first AA meeting I went into, 12-step meeting I went into, I walked in and I said, God, these people are pathetic, and that's not me. And the key word there, of course, is yet. And I ran down that rabbit hole. But at some point, you can hear in their dialogue and in the passion that they have in a 12-step meeting or a smart recovery meeting or a secular orders of sobriety, women for sobriety, men for sobriety. Pick a meeting, because those meetings are going to be attended by people just like you, who have been through the same thing you have. We're not terminally unique, and we can pick out pieces of those stories. So I think a speaker meeting, you're right, is a good place, a good, safe place, but they're all safe. Each meeting is going to have its different personality if you look at all those different types of directions or programs, but you find one that connects, that talks to you and speaks the same language that you do, and you find it easier to go to meetings most of the time. When you start liking them, then you really got a problem. Then
you admit it, right?
Yeah.
So the issue there is, and I think you didn't quite say this, but I'm with you in the meeting, walking around in the meeting and envisioning what you're talking about. But it's really meeting the people that are there and having the human connection with other people in the same boat, and you start to form some friendships, and you realize that not everybody is cookie cutter. There are different people there, and they have different attitudes and mindsets. And finding the right person that really seems to fit with who you are as a person, I think, is an important next step, as opposed to I'm just going to sit there and talk about alcohol. I think bonding with the humanity that's there in some way or another. That's why I tend to encourage closed groups, although that may be, from your perspective, I'd be interested to see what you say about it, because I think closed groups are hard to get into because the person's early in recovery.
Right. As a person who's new to recovery, they're tough to come by. But you go to enough open meetings, you're going to find the closed groups. So where I think the language kind of stalls out when you're talking about 12-step programs or any type of program is the concept of fellowship. A lot of emphasis is placed on this step, this step, this step, and especially in the naysayers who try to kick over the AA punch bowl. The focus on the steps is not the real world. The focus is on fellowship, and the steps give you a framework for getting and staying in recovery, but the fellowship is the bond that we share as people with this disease, and learning how to cope together with something that we each could not kick on our own.
So well said. Excellent. I appreciate those remarks, and I'm sure the listeners do too. Now, we talked a little bit about before this, because one of the missions here for us with Core Brain Journal is to have this conversation, but elaborate on it a little bit in terms of how can we connect with others who may not be listening to this immediate podcast, and where could we take this? So let's have a couple, if we could, Scott, if you could tell us a little bit about what you think. I really appreciate the fact that you're taking a more biologic view with this. You may not be an MD, you may not be a medical professional, but what you're recognizing as a journalist, as an insightful researcher into recovery, is that biology is an essential, important aspect of understanding the biology important in recovery. And so one of the things we were talking about was, how do we, as individuals who care about moving recovery forward in some constructive way rather than the negatives that do occur from time to time, what kind of questions should psychiatrists, psychologists, licensed clinical social workers, LPCs, pastors be asking the consultant that's in their room to really find out whether they've got an alcohol problem?
And I completely understand the time pressures that a physician or a clinician would face in their day-to-day work. The fact is, and I did an article on this about 6 months back, that the questions aren't being asked. Alcohol problems are not commonly identified in the course of routine healthcare services. And, doctors also have to rely on the patients to self-disclose. And frankly, I lied through my teeth about it. How much are you drinking? Well, I have about a 12-pack a week, when in reality, that was breakfast. So, doctors aren't screening for it. Patients aren't honest about it. But to look at overall how alcohol impacts our health and the reason why a person might be in that doctor's office or that clinician's office, you need to have the discussion. And, the systems need to be in place, and whether it's through team-based care, screening systematically for alcohol problems, a series of questions to say, how much are you drinking, and use a lot of the evidence-based studies that are out there. And it's stunning. I've got more than 254 articles on different aspects of how this toxin affects otherwise healthy tissues, which might be the reason they're there to begin with. For example, cancer. Well, if a person has a history of cancer in their family, and you have this discussion with them about their alcohol use, take, for example, women. If a woman is consuming alcohol, do they know that alcohol is the only dietary connection ever made to an increased risk of breast cancer? Probably don't know that.
That is very interesting. I appreciate you sharing that.
For every 10 grams of alcohol, which by comparison is like 1 glass of wine or 1 can of beer or 1 mixed drink, for every 10 grams of alcohol on a daily basis, that increases the risk by double digits, by 11%. Who wants to knowingly take that risk, especially when breast cancer is going to affect or touch the lives of 1 in 8 women in this country? It is a very well-known carcinogen that is hiding out there in plain sight. It also, if you follow the path that alcohol goes through your body, you can track where these complications are going to come from. Number 2 cause of oral cancers: esophageal cancer, stomach cancer, of course the liver. We know about cirrhosis, pancreatic cancer, probably the least curable of cancers out there, colon cancer, and then with women, the link to breast cancer. But there's all sorts of other connections too. If a person has concerns about dementia, this has been linked to early onset dementia in men between 40 and 60 years old. There's a lot of other health connections that people don't commonly make with the drug that they can purchase right down at the local gas station or in aisle 6 of their Winn-Dixie.
What a picture! Yeah. So that's the summer. I got caught in Winn-Dixie for a second. It was such a picture. But the deal is, what you're saying is, to go back to that questionnaire thing. Do you have a specific questionnaire that you recommend that professionals might that we could have access to, that we could put here as a show note or as a link that people could just download on the show notes?
Sure, I'll send it to you as something you can include on your show notes. It is also appearing on my website, which is alcohologist.com. And there's all the studies about alcohol and their relationship to health, but also some suggested questions for people on the medical side. what they can use. And these don't come from me. This isn't my brainstorm. This comes from the CDC. The CDC recognizes the need to address the number 3 preventable cause of death and illness in the United States by simply asking a few questions and taking the time. And again, it can be somebody on your team. It doesn't have to be the physician himself or herself.
Very key. Excellent point. And that makes it a little bit easier, because some people are uncomfortable with asking about it because they don't have a structure in their mind based on the pervasive denial that takes place. They don't really understand how to even get into it. One of the reasons they don't understand how to get into it, they wouldn't know what to do about it if the person said I had a problem. They don't really know how the meetings fit into it, recovery, whether the person needs a inpatient rehab. And one of the sorry things that's going on is that, inpatient hospitalizations are like, 3 days or 6 days now. I mean, those 28-day programs were just outstanding. I mean, I was running 28-day programs for many years, and it was really very, very interesting to see the transformation that take place.
And with a lot of the treatment facilities that I work with, the 28-day thing is really a function of insurance. That's what they're going to cover. Your body is just beginning to right itself chemically from that. You may begin to learn some new tools and tactics to use when you're facing cravings, but more and more of the treatment protocol out there calls for up to 90 days. Some of them are an entire year immersed in a partial hospitalization program or some combination of inpatient and intensive outpatient, where you're continuing to talk through stressors, talk through issues, talk through cravings once you've gotten this toxin out of your body and gone through detox and the initial kind of mental reprogramming that you can do within that 28-day constraint.
Well, and then to measure what's going on with the body and the corruptions that take place, and put some nutritional supplements in there that actually rebuild the body, so the person isn't just running on empty. It's very, very important. Now, we've alluded a couple of times to your books. I want to get down and really hear you talk a little bit about these books. I think it's really very thoughtful that you would give our audience a shot at these books, and we're gonna have it open. We're gonna only open it for a short period of time. So if people want to get in, they got to jump on it, and then we'll close it down, and we're gonna distribute it. And I think the order of the books and the way you wrote them was just so much a recovery order. It was so very cool when you told me about it. So please go ahead and talk about the titles and what they are.
Well, the first book was called What the Early Worm Gets. It came out in 2010. This was the aha moment for me in my recovery to realize that I wasn't just drinking myself to oblivion and have this disease of alcoholism. I'm exposing myself to all these other diseases, and began to look at first off the biophysical connection to disease and alcohol use beyond the disease of alcoholism. But then I was also looking in the first book at the difference between treatment and mistreatment. And there's a great deal of this going on in our country where we coerce a person to get into treatment, usually a nudge from the judge saying, oh, you got to go to a 28-day program or you're going to jail. And there's this old school of thought that says you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, but you can make them thirsty. However, I don't think you make them thirsty by drowning them in it. So this looks at the idea of treatment versus mistreatment. You do need an informed patient. You do need a willing patient, because I'm not going to do the work for them. Dr. Parker, you're not doing the work for them. No. They have to do the work themselves. Yeah. The second book is Every Silver Lining Has a Cloud.
Before you get into that, I just want to say one thing, Scott. I mean, I think it's so true. I think part of the problem with mistreatment is the recovery movement for years just invested so much energy in calling people names. And it was sort of like people would come to me and say, if this is recovery, I don't want to have to join the club. I mean, I don't want to run through, a death line to wake up every day. So anyway, enough of that. But I think it's a very good point, and it's a great place to start the conversation. Second book, sorry.
And that also goes into the idea of not treating everybody with one program. The course of treatment for any individual is going to be as different as the people are. And I'm not going to need the same program as you, Dr. Parker, or the 28-year-old Hispanic neighbor who has 3 kids. I don't we're going to be breathing a little bit differently. So let's take a different approach, a more individualized approach to the care rather than some cookie cutter that doesn't work. The second book, though, Every Silver Lining Has a Cloud, looks at relapse. And through my own relapse, 3 years after this, I thought I was cruising along on all cylinders, but there were these stressors in my life that I did not pay attention to. 4 key stressors being forgiveness, grief, guilt, and shame. And looking at those individual things, we in the recovery community talk a lot about HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, as being key triggers. But underlying all of this stuff is the general life stressors that because alcoholics have a higher baseline level of the stress hormone cortisol in our body, we're more sensitive to stress anyway. So again, back to that original point, alcoholics and non-alcoholics alike drink for the same reason, that's to relieve stress. And this comes in and takes a look at some big stressors, how to handle them, and throws in some of my own story. Again, some of the I'll tell you, this is my favorite book based on the response that I've had from families around those who are struggling with alcoholism and relapse. But it's also the one where I had to dig the deepest in my own, into the dark corners of my life and put it out there on paper, because I want people with the disease to understand that I've walked in those same darn shoes that you find yourself in. I've scratched my head. I've cried. I've felt that same frustration and moved on.
What I was thinking about as we were talking about it earlier, it's almost like relapse, recovery, and reality. I mean, it's really where the rubber meets the road. I mean, treatment and mistreatment is very good because you have to have a concept when you're going into something. It's kind of for the clients who are coming in, but it's also for practitioners. Let's get real and let's really individualize care. But relapse and recovery is reality. Your face is in the dirt on that one, and you really know and you feel the pain in that. And I'm sure that's why it's so significant.
And last year I released Adding Fuel to the Fire to look at challenging the public shame and the stigma of alcoholism. And while there's a lot we can do to help change the dialogue in this country about the disease of alcoholism, what it really boils down to for me, the person with the disease, is not allowing that public stigma to become self-stigma and sabotage my own recovery. So it is a look at public policy, public attitude, but it's also a look at a recovering person's guide to living in a essentially pro-alcohol world, because we're not going to change that. We've been through the whole prohibition thing, and none of that stuff was working, and it's kind of crazy ideas anyway. But to get in and talk about avoiding public stigma from becoming self-stigma is going to keep a lot of us back on that, or staying on that journey to recovery.
Scott, this has been really helpful. We've run out of time. These half hours go by so quickly, and I really do want to thank you. I think there's several really key operational action points that you've raised here. I think looking at your books is going to be very interesting for everybody, because it does take the way you're conceptualizing it and saying it in dramatically real ways is very important. I think the questionnaire, I'm looking forward to having that questionnaire in the show notes. And so what we're going to do, folks, is if you do corebrainjournal.com, write down 009 download, corebrainjournal.com, 009 download, just drop it over there. You'll come to a place where you can leave your name, and we're going to put that in a hat and draw the names out. We got 3 names coming up, and we're really appreciating that Scott did this, and we want to thank you very much, Scott, for your participation. In closing, tell us as we close here, what's the place that you want to drive everybody? Where would you like people to go upon hearing this, and in terms of finding more information for appropriate action?
My website, alcohologist.com, is pretty much the hub of everything that I do. I'm active on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, etc. But you can find all those links, plus links to Health Tap and Amazon, where my books are sold. Well, my books are sold everywhere, but Amazon, I like to send people there because they can communicate back with me, and that's really the part of it that I love the most. The website is alcohologist, alcohologist.com.
Great. Sorry I interrupted you. Appreciate it.
problem.
That's great. It's going to be a lot of fun, Scott. I look forward to having you back sometime. We talk about some other things. As we were talking about alcohol, I started thinking of the number of people who were thinking marijuana is okay to smoke, and then I was thinking about how they actually detoxed 2 weeks down the road and threw chairs around the unit. And then while you were talking, I was also thinking about the heroin problem that's going on. I mean, here in Tidewater, we have a very serious heroin problem, and you know, it's down in Portsmouth, Virginia. It's just as bad as it can be.
Opiates have become such a major problem, and a lot of times when I'm speaking in public, I point out that we do have a heroin epidemic right now, but we also have an alcohol pandemic that is costing our country $250 billion a year, and this is the one that we advertise on the Super Bowl a lot. So when we talk about epidemics and pandemics, that's something that I'm really passionate about.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been really fantastic talking to you, and we'll look forward to talking to you again sometime in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Parker.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.